And welcome everybody to another episode of Live at the Hive, Digital Marketing from the Trenches. And today we've got a very special guest all the way from Berlin, Germany, Angeley Mullins from Latana. I hope I'm getting that right, Angeley.
Yes, really nice to be here again.
Okay, very nice to have you. And today what we're going to be talking about is what is often the confusing world of brand marketing, brand tracking. What does that mean for businesses today in a very social, online connected world? And what kind of tools we can use to understand the brand, understand the consumer, and take action on that. And Angeley comes to us with a wealth of experience and background. Angeley, so please, I'll hand it over to you to tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe, where you started and how you got to the position of CMO at Latana.
So again, great to be here. I'm actually originally from the States, being over here in Europe, so really nice. I actually started my career in sales. Started as a salesperson and then had so much insight and information and questions, frankly, for marketing that somebody at some point just said, why don't you go take a look? And it was history ever since then. So made the transition formally into marketing, began at Amazon, which was really fantastic. Then moved through a couple of other different companies such as Intuit and then GoDaddy, and then really jumped over the other side of the pond into Europe, and I'm currently at Latana. So have had so far a fantastic career and have really focused on marketing, international expansion, demand generation, and of course, brand.
Wow. And like most marketers, I always find it a bit amusing. Marketing seems to be one of those professions that a lot of people come at it from different perspectives. Was there a specific point in time when the marketing bug really bit you, or were you already looking that way when you made that move?
I was already looking that way, but I mean, as you know, there's so many different facets to marketing, and it's one of those umbrella terms. And I really loved international expansion. I really loved go-to-market. And for me, that's much more comprehensive. I have a lot of, friends and colleagues, and it's just one thing, whether it's content marketing or performance marketing, and they have these long careers in these areas, which is good to do. But what I really love is the wide variety of it and putting all of these pieces together and formulating a marketing strategy from there.
Very, very, very cool. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about Latana. How did it start? How did you become the CMO there? And what does the platform and your brand provide?
Sure. So, Latana is a brand tracking and consumer insights platform. But before I go into that, I'll just kind of paint a picture of the industry. So consumer insights and market research, the way it used to work is you would have huge teams of researchers. And let's say in a true use case, we had a customer come to us and say, we're a pet food brand and we need to know everything about women in a certain demographic who own a dog in New York City. Okay. The way that it would work previously is you'd have tons of researchers asking pinpoint questions. It was very long, very expensive. So Latana, we said to ourselves, there has to be a way to do this. And in the market research and consumer insights industry, it hasn't come into what we call the SaaS age or the true digital age. There has to be a way to collect this information faster and to also help marketing and branding leaders really understand what is my brand worth? What are the perceptions of my brand? What do consumers think? What are the associations? And this is how we started to do it. The way we do it is with mobile optimized survey taking. So just like you or anyone in the audience has a mobile phone, most people do. And so we use that to really pinpoint people. It's completely opted in. So people understand that they're taking the survey and the purpose of the survey. And then we have a machine learning process behind that synthesizes and analyzes the data. And what it really does is help, again, marketing and brand leaders understand what is my brand worth? What's the effectiveness of my campaigns? For a rebranding, for example, or even for a go-to-market, you're launching in a new market, and you need to know my brand is perceived a certain way in this market. Is it the same way in the other market? Or who would my target audiences be in a new market? So we get lots of use cases, but it's one of those last areas of marketing that hasn't really been developed. There's a lot of performance marketing, content marketing. You have all kinds of data analytics tools out for that. On the other side, you have social listening. share of voice, Twitter, social media, but that perception and context of brand and associations, these types of things have not yet fully been developed, and that's what we aim to do at the time.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you're taking with Latana, you're taking what are probably tried and true methods for, like you say, for surveying and focus groups, and pulling in technology to help enhance and augment that process and bring it into that SaaS world to do it. I would assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, but to do it at scale.
Yes, absolutely at scale. So we find a couple things. Normally, companies will come to us with one market or one established audience, and then we have an expansion that happens. When a company expands into different markets, or let's say they start with one market and expand from there, so that's exactly a use case that we have, and it's provided all in a customizable dashboard. So it's really easy for people to slice and dice the data, understand what happens in certain situations. So people find it really easy to use, and that's why we have so much value with what we provide.
Very cool. And so members of a team within a brand would be able to log into Latana and pull information that might be relevant to their specific role in that brand process?
Yes, exactly. And it really targets in on the audiences. So for example, a marketing team might be interested in a certain demographic. We have business development teams using our product for their outreach or expansion. We have strategy teams and consumer insights teams when they want to build a long-term strategy. They're also using the data. And that's why the customizability becomes super important. And you can have different people logging into the dashboard for it.
Okay, that's very. I love taking what are traditional industries that might include, for example, a focus group, which personally, in my experience, are really statistically maybe viable, but maybe not as 100% practical in the real world.
Exactly.
Yeah, and using all that technology. But maybe we should take a step back for the audience and for our listeners here. And we just spoke about this before we started recording here. What is brand? And, most interestingly, I think, how do you measure that, what kind of feels like maybe softer metrics when people talk about their feelings on a brand? Maybe you can walk us through that process a little bit, starting with, what is a brand?
Sure, the big question.
Yeah.
So, what is a brand? For me, and what we see in the marketing world is brand is a feeling or a perception. It's an identity. So, for example, just for the sake of example, you see McDonald's and the Golden Arches. You have a certain feeling. People usually associate it with reliability. They know exactly what they're going to get when they walk in at McDonald's and make an order, no matter where in the world they are. You have Nike with their wonderful branding campaigns. People associate a feeling. One of the really great use cases, because I used to work in Seattle, is the whole, Apple versus Microsoft debate, where you have the Microsoft Surface versus the Apple computers. And even though one particular product might be superior, you still have people buying a different product because their association with the brand. So brand is in a feeling, a perception, an identity. So the big question I ask is, what do you feel when somebody says that brand name, or what do you feel when you see that logo? To me, that is what encompasses a brand. And I believe your second question was, how do you measure it? That's exactly the challenge that we're solving at Latana. What is the worth of the brand? So usually it goes by target audiences, the efficacy of big branding campaigns. For example, we've had customers come to us and they've said, oh, we think that we're progressive. We think, that we are cutting edge. And then when we do huge amounts of surveys via our mobile devices, the customers are coming back and they're saying, well, actually not really. We think this, and that. So this all goes into those softer KPIs of what the brand is worth. But I have to say that softer KPIs are just as important and sometimes can be more important.
You know what? That's an excellent point. And in our experience, so we come from a digital background, and obviously over the last several years, it's risen in importance and prominence. But one of the interesting things that I've noted is, 15 years ago, when you went to digital, you could throw up a Google ad, for example, in the very early days, and you're bringing in new customers. And as things have become saturated and more people are using it, it's almost like what's old is new again. Right, which is that brand feeling, which, to your point, Apple and Microsoft is a fantastic example of that, which is the individuals' motivations behind Apple are very probably different than they are behind Microsoft, but both are equally as strong when it comes to things like purchasing decisions, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I like what you're saying, the old is new. But I think what I would say is the golden rule is still the golden rule, which is you have to understand the perception that your brand has on your particular target audience,
Hmm.
and even understand, do you have the right target audience for where you want to go for your strategy? And these are the core fundamentals that we aim to solve at Latana. You also
Hmm.
mentioned, there's so many data tools out there. And I think we've gotten to a stage now in the industry, we've got data paralysis. There's
Yes.
so much. And you put out a campaign, it comes back, it interacts, but you find that maybe that campaign isn't really helping you to drive the incremental growth.
Hmm.
So it's almost saying, an analogy would be like surgery successful, but the patient died kind of thing. You want to make sure that it adds to the overall value of the strategy and make sure that it goes the way we want it to go. So
Yeah, totally. And I think one of the big things, a couple of really big points that you made there that I think are really excellent to reinforce is a lot of marketing teams and businesses in general will say, like to your point, we are progressive, we are tongue in cheek. We may think we're all these things, but in the world of brand, it doesn't really matter what you think. It's how you're instilling that into your audience and what they think back, right?
exactly.
Yeah. So one of the questions I think, and we're gonna dive into kind of each one of the major points, including how to like what actions should we take from all of this data. You did mention things like share of voice and monitoring Twitter. For smaller businesses that maybe aren't at the enterprise level, do you see a lot of things like social media monitoring replacing things like brand monitoring, which are probably somewhat different? And how can a smaller business, an SMB, for example, kind of look at their branding and begin that process of investigation? Obviously, using Latana would be the first step, but is there a process you have where you start to decompose some of these things to help make things understandable and actionable from a marketing perspective?
What I find is, especially in the SMB space, a lot of
Hmm.
marketing leaders, or sometimes even if they're so small they don't have a formal marketing department, it's somebody that is leading this business. What I find is people are confusing what these things are. They are confusing social listening with performance marketing and content marketing and what brand tracking is. And I've actually had discussions at Latana with prospective clients, and they're asking questions like, what's the difference between performance marketing and brand tracking? Or I'm doing social listening, share a voice. Does that mean people have a positive perception of my brand? And then I have to say, I'm sorry, it just means that at the moment, they're responding to kind of what you're saying. That's totally different things. So I think
Hmm.
it's first to have marketing is a holistic system, and it consists of brand awareness, it consists of demand generation, it consists of core content, marcom, and to have a comprehensive strategy. And so brand awareness is one of those pillars.
Hmm.
It's not the entirety, but what's happened over the past 10 years is it's been so data driven that the brand awareness piece has fallen off the wagon almost, so to speak, where that's actually one of the most critical pieces. What's the
Hmm.
identity that we want to have as a brand? How do we want consumers to feel about us? Does this actually relate to our target audience? And that one is the most critical piece that many marketing and brand leaders, or even strategy leaders, don't seem to dive into, or they seem to overlook, or they leave for last
Hmm.
after they've spent all the money on campaigns where they think they have a direction, and then they find that, oops, we missed the mark, or we missed who our target audience actually is, or what they actually think.
Yeah, it's almost like the old saying, "Ready, shoot, aim."
Exactly.
Right? Where yeah, you really need to start at the brand and focus there. Um, that's all really great. And the other thing is information over data, right? So I might be reaching here, but let me know if I am. But with Latana, is that the notion there is getting information and actionable information over 1 million data points that you might cobble together?
Exactly. And I would add to that and say context in addition to your data. And the
Hmm.
context is really what's important when you have data. So, who is the target audience? What is the market? We have customers, for example, delivery customers who they have different go to market strategies in different cities. Same
Hmm.
product, same service, completely different cities, different target markets, different audiences that perceive the product and the brand in completely different ways. This is the core example. So it's really important.
Yeah, for sure. And just curious, in your experience, having worked with so many different brands and so many different projects at Latana, what's your take on that audience identification? Is it typically really fleshed out well, or is there a lot of work to do? You mentioned a great example, same potential target market, two different cities, that can change things immensely. I'd love to hear kind of some of your experiences with that and how you work with those brands to help kind of sharpen that knife, I guess.
Sure. So we work with all kinds of different demographics and KPIs, everything from age to education level, income, location. Some customers are looking for markets, meaning markets of the world or particular countries in totality. Some are looking for regions, especially when you look at either Europe, a particular region, or in the United States, a particular state or a group of states. We've now seen over the past 2 years companies diving into the city level. And so city level tracking becomes more and more important. And I think that was one of the outcomes, of the pandemic era. Everybody's getting delivery. So city level tracking is becoming really, really important for us. We also have what's called, customized type of questions. So for example, if you're buying mattresses, which was one of our clients, have you purchased a house or have you gotten into a new apartment, indicators that they would buy. So these type of specific questions I think is also really important, and they can be customized to the customer or the potential target audience.
That's actually a great point. One of the things with Honeypot, what we do is we end up doing obviously quite a bit of performance marketing, campaign management, et cetera. One of the things we like to talk about is the stronger the audience development is, including things like someone, for example, that lives in Los Angeles would be very different than someone that may live in Austin, Texas, for example. And the stronger your ability to understand that niche, the better your targeting is going to be, the more highly qualified your leads will be, the better your sales team is going to be able to understand those things. Is there a specific process you walk through at Latana with when you're putting this together? Because it sounds like you're coming up with these uh, in-depth surveys that are highly targeted. Is there a process that you go through with a client when you're identifying these things in terms of putting those items together?
Exactly. So what we do is we really work with our clients to understand how do they want to use this data? What's the ultimate result that they want to use? We've had people that have come to us that said, look, we want to do a complete rebrand, but we have different sectors or different regions, and we need that brand perception to go across all levels. We've also had other customers saying we're opening up stores, whether it's digital or physical store in different locations. We need to understand what that perception is in those different locations before we open the store. So it's super important. Having that conversation up front and understanding what the expectation is about the data is the most important thing. And we help them craft how we should do the survey, what the results is that we want to see. And from there, you start with one wave. And the nice thing about brand tracking is it's over time. So that means you can compare the results over time, monthly, quarterly, biannually. A lot of people are actually doing monthly tracking with us because they have so many campaigns happening.
Okay, no, that's a couple of really great points that I think strategically for anyone listening would be understanding. Typically people are setting goals and saying, I want X number of signups, X number of new customers, X churn rate, very, very specific data point driven. But understanding what you're going in with, what are you looking to achieve, being probably the number one thing that you should be defining, which I think a lot of us don't necessarily do. Understanding what we want to get out of it.
It's really important, I would say, especially with so much data driven marketing over the past 10 years. It's all about optimizing a specific KPI on whichever channel you're going to market with. And we haven't spent a lot of time taking a step back, understanding how this relates into the bigger picture. And so that's what Latana aims to solve. And this can be the difference of a country launch going well or not, spending millions on a rebrand, it going well or not, or even if you're S&B and you want to launch your initial brand campaigns, and it might be, even though your budget might be small, this spend is going to be a significant amount of that budget. You want to make sure you get it right. You want to make sure that when you go to market or you start to work on your brand awareness, you're moving in the right direction. You are pairing your message with the right target audience, and you're making sure that that audience has a good perception of who you are, or it matches what you want them to feel.
Absolutely. That's a great piece of advice. So you mentioned rebranding, and I'm assuming at Latana you work with multidisciplinary teams in these organizations. What are some of your pieces of advice for, regardless of size, the process of rebranding, deciding, how do we understand this, right? So, and what are the steps that you would take in terms of a rebranding program based on some of the insights that Latana could give you?
I would say first, a rebrand is it's a crucial and a critical decision, because it really means that you as a company or a marketing leader have found a critical either flaw or a critical change in direction that you need to make. And it's a scary thing for a lot of marketing leaders, because if they get it wrong and it goes in the opposite direction from the status quo, it's a huge deal for the company. So I think at this critical juncture, usually it means that sales and revenue, something's happening there, or there's different markets, or sometimes there's many product lines that need to be consolidated, or there's a fundamental shift in the direction of the company. So my first recommendation is, again, make sure that you are aligned on what you want to get out of it. And it's the most important thing. I know it sounds very conventional and simplistic, but you'd be surprised how many times, and teams of highly intelligent people, and they miss this critical step. What do you want to get out of it? And not just from a data perspective, not just we want to launch in different markets and our revenues go up X%, but what is the change in perception that you want to get out of it? What is the change in your target audience's consumer behavior? What's the change in the brand awareness that you think you're going to get or that you'd like to achieve? That's the very, very first step.
And as you mentioned, and I think this is something that's really important that distinguishes Latana, is the frequency of keeping track of that progress through the process of that rebranding. And do you work with those brands through that process?
Absolutely.
As well?
So the nice thing about monthly tracking that we're able to offer is you can establish the baseline over time, and then you can understand the inflections and attribute those inflections back. You can do things like brand understanding, associations, and you can really get that context. So again, not just data points, something went up by a certain percent, the context behind it. And that's where the data becomes really meaningful.
Yeah. And so within the process of setting up with Latana and working with your team, what are some of the most challenging aspects of this rebranding process? Is it that first step, or do you have any advice for companies that may be looking at this process and maybe have a little bit of trepidation over potentially opening up Pandora's box? And maybe do you have any experiences when that's occurred, and how did you deal with those?
Of course. What I would say is, from the marketing and branding leaders that we work with, their biggest challenge is selling it internally within their company. Because branding and brand awareness is the last arena of marketing, and everybody has that question, what is my brand worth? Leadership within their organizations wants to have everything lined out beforehand. So this is where Latana becomes extremely valuable. The tracking over time, showing the difference in awareness, showing the difference in the associations, the customized questions, so that marketing and branding leaders can sell it effectively. A lot of times they know what needs to be done, but not everyone else in the organization is in marketing and brand. and they need to be able to sell it. And because it's not completely data driven down to every single micro KPI, sometimes it's difficult in these type of circumstances. And I would say other leadership within the organization might not be aware of how crucial and critical it is to make that change. So this is,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is one of the beautiful things about what Latana offers, is that it gives marketing and branding leaders so much more context to the data to be able to not only explain the benefit and the potential outcomes, but to sell it internally within their company.
Yeah, and I think the words I would use to express that are winning hearts and minds internally within an organization. Do you find that this process is fairly well received when you're going through this process, or are there, say, harder nuts to crack in terms of various internal personas on that say buying committee or the committee that puts these types of programs together?
I would say that if this was 5 years ago, it would be a tougher nut, so to speak. But now in this time, like I said, there's so much data-driven marketing. We've got to this data paralysis. So CEOs and executive teams are really looking for what's the context. And that's become the new norm. What's the context? So it really has opened the doors for companies like Latana to come in and give that added value. So it's really not that you have to sell on brand tracking, but it's the what are we marrying this to inside the organization. And so, like I said, usually there's these critical moments. You have a new strategy, you're launching into a new market, you want to do a rebrand, or you're an SMB and you just want to start, with your branding efforts and make sure that they're successful. You want to dive into your target audiences. You're going to start spending a lot of money in brand. Any of the above are usually, the catalysts for customers to come to us.
Yeah, and I think a few things that make what you're offering so appealing right now is one is obviously, every time a new social platform rises, like a TikTok, for example, and what we're seeing now, there's hundreds more data points to consider in that, and sometimes the bigger picture can get lost. I find it fascinating, and that's kind of what's old is new again, is going back to this bigger picture of brand. And so in terms of how you distribute, because one of the things with Latana is being able to make better marketing decisions. How do you go through that process if you've got, customer support, client success, obviously marketing? You've got several different players that all have aligned but somewhat different immediate motivations. How do you go about explaining all of this through those different groups? Is there a process that you would use for that?
So we start with marketing and brand leaders. They come to us. Usually what happens is they're partnering with consumer insights teams or strategy departments, etc. Internally within Latana, we have customer support teams that handle onboarding. We have a research department that will also handle very specific questions. And that's actually the nice thing, because you can throw out there, hey, I'm looking at tracking this. The researcher might come back and say, look, our experience in this market or these types of questions, this might be a better way to phrase it. This might be a better way to do it, weekly, monthly, whatever it might be. So you really have the expertise and the support to help not only the marketing and brand leaders, but also whoever they're partnering with internally to make sure that all the bases are covered.
And would it be fair to say that Latana is somewhat disrupting the traditional market surveying focus group space? Would that be fair?
Yes, more than fair is what I would say. As we all know, brand and the question, what is my brand worth and what's the brand awareness? That's the last arena of marketing that has not really been disrupted. There are data analytics tools up the wazoo in every which way for campaign performance, demand generation, content marketing, etc. But once you get to that area of brand, it becomes quite fuzzy. And this is what a lot of other leadership within the company says, well, that's a fuzzy thing. And, you do all these campaigns and what do we get back for it? And there's not direct attributions. So this is the thing where you, again, not just data metrics, but context. This is where the context becomes super important. And it's not just this is the raw data, but this is what it means in the voice of the consumer. And I think that's the piece that really adds value, the voice of the customer, to give context behind the data.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I really love, and you mentioned it there, one of the things that's really great about what you're saying is, um, what's the performance effect of this? Like, how is this moving the needle? What does this, actually all mean? And to your point, we get stuck into this, well, we got X number of impressions or engagements on Twitter, for example. What does that mean? Right? Sometimes it's like, we're not sure, but we know it's good. It's going in the right direction. Do you find that being able to connect these somewhat disparate worlds of digital performance marketing, which is kind of how people perceive it, which is X number of clicks and X conversion rate and Y cost per lead, to the strategic side, is that a bridge that you're building to connect those two worlds?
Absolutely. So I would say on one side of that bridge, you have performance marketing and demand generation. And on the other side of that bridge, you have social listening. So exactly your Twitter example. This is trending, everybody's talking about it, but how do you relate these two elements? So brand tracking is that bridge in between, and it gives that context. It gives context for immediate campaigns, strategy launches, etc., and all those KPIs. It also gives context for those soft KPIs, social listening, share of voice, what's happening in the social universe, and it puts it together with the data. And again, it adds that layer of context. What does that mean? So for example, if everybody's trending on a topic or you have a lot of activity, is it activity in the right direction? Are they associating it with what you would like them to associate it with? Is my awareness going up or down, or did it just spike momentarily? So these are all the things that marketing leaders, brand leaders, but also CEOs, all different executives need to understand to move the business forward or to change the business in the way that they would like to change.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, you make a great point about social listening often being confused with your brand. However, listening on social, for example, can often get a lot of customer service feedback, which is great, right? You want to have that feedback and understand all of that. But that, at least in my experience, is often confused with listening about the brand itself and what's happening out in the world.
Exactly. And I mean, especially over, the past year, we've seen fundamental shifts in how consumers are relating to brands, the values of consumers, and how their expectations have changed in relation to companies who they buy from, the brand perception. So this is extremely important to be able to not only follow the trend, but to get in front of it, especially with your core audience. And that's the value of what Latana provides. It's not just a spread everything out there, but it's a targeted solution for your core audience.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, thank you so much. Just before we wrap up on processing all of this brand information that you've downloaded into the internet here, and the audience, what are some core pieces of advice for the SMB or even the enterprise that may be hitting a roadblock with this in terms of how to start understanding your brand and how your consumers think about it? What are some of the top pieces of advice you could impart on our listeners today?
The first piece of advice is to start at the beginning with brand awareness, especially with SMBs. They usually leave it to last. They usually are focused on get as much demand generation as possible and just get leads flowing in and get some activity in the door. And they're not looking at the perception of their brand or what brand means. In the marketing world, we always say 80% on, I'll just say everything else, and 20% on brand spend. Really understand what you want to achieve, because if you start brand and brand awareness right at the beginning, this is the gift that keeps on giving. It will grow over time, and this is the longevity, the LTV, the stickiness, every single thing that a business leader wants. You start with brand and brand awareness. So I would say start now, start early, start now, and just make sure that you have identified where you want to go with it.
That's great advice. And just for everybody listening, if you go to latana.com, we'll post a link in the description. There is a wealth of webinars, white papers, case studies. One of the things I love about the way that you folks are doing things over at Latana and I'm going to assume as the CMO, you've been a driving force, is there's a lot of information there. If I'm, wanting to educate myself, regardless of the size of the business, maybe you can highlight just a few of the key assets that you've put front and center at Latana.com that would be of use to somebody listening that maybe wants to start exploring this process.
Absolutely. And I would actually say that we have a wonderful content team. It's not me alone. We have an excellent marketing and it's specifically a content team that's really driving this. I would point anyone listening to this to go to our website, look under resources, Ultimate Guide to Brand Tracking, Ultimate Guide to Rebranding, Consumer Insights Report 2022. There's tons of fantastic webinars. The consumer, behavior that we talk about, mental health marketing, how to align your values. So there's tons of really great, I would say, juicy content. We also have tons of articles that talk about, leading industry trends. So for example, Netflix, what's happening with them? How is that going to Twitter when the whole thing first started with Elon Musk? How does that affect their brand? We also go into smaller mid-sized brands that are just growing, in the delivery space, in the health and wellness space, e-learning, all kinds of different industries. So Latana.com and go to resources. There's a wealth of information.
Awesome. Well, Angeley, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Live at the Hive. We really appreciate you taking out the time, and hopefully that heat wave that you're experiencing over across the pond in Germany breaks for you soon.
Thank you, Dan.
All right, everyone. That wraps it up for this episode of Live at the Hive, Digital Marketing from the Trenches. We will see you next week, same B time, same B channel. Peace.